Well, I've been on that bandwagon of defending Dr. Dennis MacDonald's work on Greek mimesis in the New Testament. Are these New Testament authors cleverly devising narratives, constructing their stories about Jesus, Mark, using, let's just say the Gospel of Mark, using the Hebrew Bible in some way, the LXX? Well, yeah. Academics have jumped on board for this for centuries. We've seen that. And even some Christians are willing to grant maybe some of it's constructed theologically and doesn't mean everything that's written there literally happened. We've got a bigger fish to fry when we start talking about Greek literature impacting Mark, or even Latin literature like the Aeneid. So I've been wrestling with online apologists lately and contesting their whole claims that the origins of Christianity are strictly, staunchly, wholly separate from Greek literature. And I had to super chat none other than Professor Robyn Faith Walsh, who's written a wonderful book on the origins of Christian literature with the Gospels. And guess what? We have 2 lecture series, call it a course if you want, that will be out for purchase. One on Paul, one on the Gospels, where we go deep and she gets to teach you. So you'll be able to be a student when that comes out. But on History Valley's channel, James Stevens Valiant and Jacob Berman interview her, and I had to super chat a few questions. Is Mark's secret Messiah motif of Jesus mimetically drawing from Odysseus? Nobody knew it was Odysseus until Eurycleia recognized the scar, the dog recognized that it was actually him by his scent, things like that. But only very few people had subtle clues that discovered it was actually their master, Odysseus, king of Ithaca. And little hints here and there through the Gospel of Mark indicate that they're touching that he is the Son of God, but they don't really know who he is. His identity is hidden. The only person who really knows is the reader, just like Homer. Let's hear what Robyn Faith Walsh has to say. I hope you like the video. Share this out. Keep in mind, it's not just Dr. Dennis R. MacDonald who thinks that there's something going on with Homer's Odyssey, the Iliad, Vergil's Aeneid. We've got Robyn Faith Walsh, you've got Richard C. Miller, and there are several other people, even others who are being persuaded by the work, like Dr. Kipp Davis, Dead Sea Scroll, Hebrew Bible scholar, and others. Matthew Munger, who also is a philologist and deep into the Dead Sea Scrolls as well. I mean, several academics who are coming from that angle. And by the way, I've heard in recent news that we actually have a Catholic scholar, Jack Bull, who I think is actually persuaded that Dennis MacDonald is onto something with this mimesis to the Greek literature. That's right, even Christians recognize this. And I'm so glad that some are. And I hope more do, because I just want to get the facts. At the end of the day, your faith is your faith. But what's going on? What are the facts on the ground with this literature? That's what we're here for. Thanks for tuning in.
MythVision podcast. Thank you for the super chat, Derek. Can we all just admit Dr. Walsh is the best by saying, man, grab her book and get ready for her lectures?
Hi, Derek.
Derek, you and I both know that she is the coolest thing since sliced bread, okay? Yeah, I recommend every word that Professor Walsh has written. I think it's critically important to this discussion, and I can only echo the amen from friend Derek Lambert, okay?
Thank you.
Go out and get her books and look for the next one.
Yeah, I should. I'm trying to get my grades in so I can work on it, but hopefully I'll finish it this summer.
MythVision podcast. Thank you for your super chat. Dr. Walsh, do you think Jesus' hidden identity in Mark is working off Odysseus and Homer, or something literary in the Aeneid?
I think both. So there's some implications here, the Aeneid being written in Latin and the Homer writing in Greek. But the trope in question is the recognition of the hero. Odysseus and coming home is not immediately recognized, except I think by the dog. the dog. I think I have that passage right. One of the more heartbreaking passages.
He sees the scar on his leg too. The boar.
Okay, all right. But there's a passage about the dog, right?
Yes, the dog.
I think that one made me cry.
The dog recognizes his master and then falls over dead. That's really.
No, I can't.
Yeah,
it's brutal. That passage is brutal. As a dog person. So there's that, and then it's a trope within the work of Vergil, where for example, Camilla. And this is in the chapter that I mentioned previously that will be coming out in the next Quest volume. That's edited by Crossley and Keith. In Vergil, when a character like Camilla comes into the scene, the word that's used in Latin is akin to the Greek word thauma, which means wonder. And so whenever a hero comes into the scene and is not immediately recognized, usually the crowds around the hero are described as awestruck, as dumbfounded, as confused, bewildered. They don't recognize the hero. They ask each other, who is this person? And then the person leaves the scene, and there are some words where, they're amazed or astounded to the point of just like being completely out of their minds. Like you see different variations on this concept of wonder. And it's the exact language you have in Mark. So the thing that I argue in this forthcoming piece is that what the author of Mark is doing is tapping into that same motif that you find in Homer and that you find in Vergil of epic, where the hero is not recognized. So the thing we call the messianic secret, Jesus comes in, he performs his miracle. People go, who the heck is this guy? He performs a thauma. He performs what we call a miracle, and people go, who is he? What is he doing? They're dumbfounded, they're astounded, and he leaves. At least the reason I leaned on Vergil more than Homer, but here I think it's Dennis MacDonald's work that's being referenced. And I think it's a very strong argument to go back to Homer. I'm sure Vergil's using Homer, right? But the reason I lean on Vergil more than Homer.
Yes, Vergil's definitely using Homer.
He's definitely using Homer.
Yeah.
The reason I lean on Vergil a little more is just because the subversive figure. Camilla is a woman and a warrior, and she's not supposed to be that. And Jesus is a Messiah who dies. Right. So this idea of the subversive figure causing confusion, or the hero causing confusion, and then couple that with passages about not being recognized in your hometown, etc. I think that that's a literary trope, but the theological argument about messianic secret, I think, has thrown us off that literary trope for some time.
Well, there are parts in Mark where Jesus says to the disciples, I talk to everyone else in parables, and I talk to you behind the scenes. I tell you all the truth, but I tell them so that they won't be saved, and I'm going to tell you so you will be saved. Where there's other places where Jesus says, he performs a miracle. He says, shh, don't tell them that I did this miracle. Keep it under wraps. And so that builds up to the point where someone says, well, is there a theme here of a messianic secret? Is Jesus keeping keeping this a secret?
Yeah, no, and I understand that's a distinction in that particular argument, but I think that it explains. I think by leaning on the messianic secret as an explanatory model for that structure of the gospel, that's the kind of thing, by focusing on theology, that throws you off the scent of what is being asked in this question, which is, is the gospel author working off of some literary trope they learned, a motif somewhere? What are they alluding to, right? And so then you can start to ask more questions about, like, well, what's up with this guy? Like, why is he writing this in the first place? It can't just be about the community, right? And then it's back to the thing about like, well, how do we reconstruct early Christianity? Is it the people who had no idea who this guy was and then he walked away? Like those are your early Christians. It's literary.
Right.
Yeah.
It's literary.
MythVision, another podcast, another super chat. Thank you, Derek. What if the earliest Jesus groups were educated?
Yeah. It's kind of my point.
The earliest Jesus group.
Yeah.
Well, I think to be especially on the religious side of any of these movements, you do have to have some kind of education. I mean, you look at for example, let's take the Dead Sea Scrolls sectarians themselves. They were literate. They were educated in their own traditions. As I say, Greek ideas were already by osmosis filtering in even in the Maccabean period even. So in the 2nd and 1st centuries BC, even there we can see that our hardcore, militant, separatist, messianic Jews were literate, educated. So we're talking about compared to what situation? And we're talking about, I think with Jewish rebels of the 1st and 2nd century, we're talking about the mass movement and what you might expect there. But I would ask you to contrast the Dead Sea Scrolls sectarian documents with the New Testament, because we don't have 1st century, alas, documents from the 1st century rebels, but I think the closest approximation to what their positions would have been can be found in those sectarian documents. They're militant like the sectarians of the Dead Sea Scrolls were. They're nationalist, separatist, messianic, apocalyptic. It just sort of it checks off all the same boxes, and it makes sense that they would be part of the next step in that developing tradition.
And it's sort of the nature of the evidence. And I think that's something we have to pay attention to. And one thing that I have tried to argue, I guess is the way to put it, but one thing that I've thought quite a bit about in doing my work is, why do we have an idea of the opposite, or at least why do we have a predominant idea that these are groups, people who are producing these materials are, in groups and communities, are, not educated despite the nature of what we're seeing with these documents. Where have we come up with that construction, that historical construction? And it seems to me to be something along the lines of what we receive in Acts, or at the end of the canonical Gospels, this idea of, these fishermen huddled in an attic. And I think sometimes we make a little bit of a well-intentioned but historical mistake in assuming that the people that Jesus ministers to in the Gospels, those must be the original Christians, right? And so the Christian groups must have sprung from those groups of people he's talking to, that he's healed, that he's performed miracles for. And what that does, though, is just aggregate the nature of the evidence, right? These Gospels are later. Paul does not emphasize that Jesus, he tells us a couple of, or one teaching of Jesus's from the historical Jesus, but his emphasis is not on the kind of stories that you then get from the Gospels. So our earliest evidence for Jesus groups are not the Gospels and the people that Jesus is surrounded by in the Gospels, the fishermen, the lepers, the people who are from caste society that do need love, attention, healing, compassion, right? And that's an important part of Jesus's message, and one I'm not trying to take away from. But the earliest evidence from a historical perspective for Christianity is Paul, an educated Pharisee, that then by the time you get to the Gospels, you have these texts being written in Greek. And the only people who could have done it are people who were educated. And then here I'd like to note the fantastic work of Candida Moss. And she has some articles on this in a forthcoming book this year about, the people who, so take Luke's preface, who are the sponsors or the patrons of this kind of writing. They don't have to do the writing themselves. They can pay for somebody to do it, but still take kind of credit for it as the person who's sponsoring it, right? Those are elites as well, right? Both cultural elites, educated elites, and possibly more economically elite than we traditionally associate the early Christian movement with. And of course, that's challenging because of what the Gospels tell us, right? Or because, it's central to the Christian message that there's redemption for those who are downtrodden, who are not wealthy, who are not, the elites, whether, again, cultural, economic, societal. And that's a message I think resonated with people rightfully. I think it's an ethical message that is crucially important today as much as any other time in human history. And that shouldn't be taken away, but we shouldn't confuse the resonance of that message with the people who carried it forward through the documents and the nature of the evidence that we use.
Well, see, and that's it. I am pretty well convinced. Well, first of all, yes, kudos to great Professor Candida Moss. Do you want to announce anything at this point, Jacob, on that? I'll just leave it. I'll just leave that sort of hanging out there.
Yeah, I will at the end.
We may hear more from Professor Moss on this channel. I'll just leave it tantalizing out there like that. I'm a great admirer, as everyone knows, of Candida Moss. But it seems to me that the rebels definitely would be most popular among the poor and the disaffected, as opposed to the wealthy who were succeeding in Roman society at the time. So our rebels are more likely to be this category of the poor, or the poor priests, or even within the Dead Sea Scrolls, the concept poor is used as sort of code language for their own group, even though not all of them were poor. And even if, as Josephus says, the Essenes held all their property in common and were concerned about the poor. That's something the Essenes seem to have shared with the original Jesus movement, I would put forth. And that's where that actually comes from. But then again, Josephus himself praises the Essenes for this economic policy and admires them Josephus admires the Essenes greatly for taking care of the poor and holding their property in common. So that's not unique to the rebels, but let me suggest that poor language is coming from the rebel end of it. Politically speaking, it makes more sense to me.
We also can't forget that often elites use references to people who are, not elite to make their points, meaning there's also a literary trend in this period. It's not just a literary trend. I think it's a rhetorical move that's often made that, and we still do it today, which is that, the eggheads in the ivory tower don't know everything. It's the every man, right? Or every human, but the every person who has greater, whether we call it street smarts or we call it, what's something else you would hear? Like, I went to the university of like the real world, right? Yeah, hard not, right. So we still create this dichotomy, and perhaps, it is earned in some ways, but my point being, in this period, there was very much, you see it in the Greek novel, the idea that the true person of faith, and this is Greco-Roman religion, including Judaism and including what we might call Christianity or any other tradition from the Greco-Roman era and the Roman era, that, somebody who grew up in the country, never went to school, spent their days, out in the fields, are more in commune with nature and with the gods or with God than somebody who went and studied it for their entire lives. And so to have those people, both at a time when that is a dominant discourse, I would say, among elites themselves, but also to have that featured in texts that are trying to talk about the Galilee of Judea, which is a place where you're more likely to find people of that ilk than, say, within Judea, within Jerusalem. It fits, right? And but we should not mistake, especially when you see the activity of Paul. Paul is not going around Judea trying to find Gentiles, right? That's not what he's doing. And so when we're talking, again, historical versus literary constructions of history, what we have is Paul going around the eastern part of the empire, talking to people about his idea about this movement with Gentiles who are curious about Judeans and about Judaism. That's what he's doing. And he's teaching them about the Jewish scripture, and he's coupling that with the Greco-Roman philosophy that makes him kind of, plugged in. I think you used the word popular before. He's plugged in to popular ideas at the time. And then the gospel authors pick that up, but they know the region they have to talk about. And this is back to the mythicist thing too, right? Like they know the region they have to talk about. They have to talk about the Galilee. And they reconstruct the people there. And I would say that there's a social justice aspect to this that I think is important in being attentive to these reconstructions of the poor and the downtrodden and Jesus himself, and remembering that we have to think about these persons and what they represent as more than just fodder for understanding, a conceptualization and idealization of the early Christian movement, and to think about those.
It's a huge part of contemporary Roman literature. Vespasian himself plays up his humble origins. He's a country bumpkin. And
Augustine does the same thing, actually.
Yeah, accent. He plays up his humble origins. He came from poverty. Vespasian's a self-made guy. He jokes around about his countrified accent. In Latin, plaustra, plaustra, that kind of thing. Not only that, his son Titus was born in this humble little shack in lower class Rome, and when he became emperor, became a pilgrimage site for the cult of the Flavians. They'd go to the humble place where Titus was born in miserable poverty, only to become the emperor of Rome. So Roman emperors were using specifically that kind of propaganda. We too come from the common guy. We too are the best for the poor. If you read Pliny the Elder's dedication to his natural history, which was published in the reign of Vespasian, his friend, he compares Vespasian to God. What makes Vespasian God? Like his father-like love and compassion for all of his people. When you read Suetonius's biography of Titus, he stripped all of his mansions of all of his wealth so he could help the poor who were suffering from fires and disease. So it was a massive, being pro-welfare and being pro-poor and being from humble origins was an important part of contemporary Roman political propaganda at the time, as well as Christian ideology.
Yeah, Augustine actually does the same thing where he says, I didn't have any friends because I was just smarter than everybody. So no one could keep up with me. So I just stayed at home. And just like, I was a homebody who's self-taught, but I just kind of naturally knew all these things. With the idea of like plugging in, not because you're coming from like, you're not, you ignore the fact that you've got, like your father's the emperor. Ignore the fact that, somebody left you, like a trust fund. Like, forget that. Like, I'm a self-made, but people don't change that much, to be honest. And so you see that throughout. I mean, even when people start speculating that Nero has resurrected.
The Nero. There were at least 3 phony Nero.
They're all like rural dudes. Like there's a guy who played the flute.
Right.
He's kind of hot. He reminds me of Nero. He's a really good lyre player. Like, I think I made a joke previously, like he's like the Justin Bieber of this region. So.
Right, but how fascinating. Nero, we think of as this bad guy. We think of this movie Quo Vadis.
Yeah, everybody loved that guy.
The evil Nero in our minds fiddling as Rome burns. But think of it, he must have been popular.
Yeah.
Otherwise, these resurrected Nero things wouldn't keep coming up. And in the late 1st century, we have at least 3 of them. Yeah,
there's sort of a coddling rhetorical move around the Roman emperors. I mean, like even Caligula, the name means little boots, like little boots. Like there's sort of this personalizing that goes on between empire and subject. That I guess made it more palatable to be ruled with an iron fist. I don't know. But you can kind of see that construction.